Spider-Man has a rogues gallery that is fairly well known and full of great villains. Having just finished up Marvel's Spider-Man not too long ago, I battled a number of Spider-Man's villains in the video game universe that Marvel's Spider-Man takes place in. You get to fight many villains over the course of the game, but not all of these villains are given equal treatment in the game. I want to spend time ranking the villains of Marvel's Spider-Man. Basically, I'm just going by what I think some of the best villains were in the game. This may be due to their impact in the story, if they have a particularly fun boss fight, or any other factors that come to mind. This means that this ranking will include spoilers, so if you haven't played the first Spider-Man yet, be warned. I am setting up a couple of rules, though. I'm not including anti-heroes, so that means that there is no Black Cat or Silver Sable in the list. I'm also not including villains that you don't fight or at least chase through the city. This means no Norman Osborn or J. Jonah Jameson. Well, I'm kind of joking about J. Jonah, but yeah, you could make an argument that he's a villain as well. I am also including the DLC here, since any new copy of Spider-Man will have this included. Also, as with any list, this is just my opinion. You're allowed to have different ones. In fact, it's often a lot of fun to hear what your own rankings are, especially compared to mine, how they're different, how they're the same. It's usually a lot of fun to kind of see those differences. So feel free to respectfully let me know your rankings in the comments. But that's enough of the intro. Let's get to the rankings. At number 12, I have Screwball. She's at the very bottom of the pile. Even though I didn't mind her challenges, in fact, I found them much more enjoyable than another villains, she just felt goofy. She didn't really feel like much of a threat at any point. She just kind of felt more like a big nuisance, which is maybe how she's supposed to feel, but that doesn't really make a good villain in my mind. The idea of a social media obsessed villain is interesting, and I had never heard of Screwball before the game, but I kind of understood why I probably hadn't. She seems more of kind of a gimmicky, silly villain than really one that ever is taken too seriously. At number 11, I've got Taskmaster. To be honest, I felt that Taskmaster was just criminally underutilized in Spider-Man. He set up challenges, which I personally did not find very much fun, around New York and watched how Spider-Man took these challenges down. Since Taskmaster is all about being able to copy the moves of people by watching them, this is what he's doing to Spider-Man. However, beyond coming and fighting you after you complete all of the challenges, he doesn't really do anything more or have any impact on the story beyond that. He's an optional challenging boss fight, but that's really about all that he is in the game, which is kind of a letdown because Taskmaster could have been super interesting to have kind of be more of an impact in the game. At number 10, I've got Shocker. You get to face off against Shocker twice in the game, but to be honest, for a villain that you interact with twice, he's not super memorable. He doesn't really engage much with Spider-Man's quips, which, I mean, some of those are really funny. And he doesn't even really seem to be wanting to commit the crimes that he's doing during the city. It's more that he's being forced to by someone stronger under threat. He basically serves as the introduction to a new crime organization coming onto the scene in the Demons. His battle was somewhat interesting, but his role in the story is pretty limited, and so he doesn't really rank too high. At number 9, I've got Electro. I'm pretty sure the language of Sinister Six is never really used in the game. At least I can't remember it. Maybe it was mentioned somewhere and I just missed it or just forgot about it. But that's pretty much who Spider-Man is facing off against in the third act of the game. Electro is a member of this Sinister Six who breaks out of the raft and goes up against Spider-Man. Sadly, most of the Sinister Six are left fairly underdeveloped. You get some reason why they joined up with Dr. Octopus, but not much more than that. And so I'm sticking Electro at the bottom of that group. I'm doing this because there wasn't a lot special about him, and his reason for joining Dr. Octopus was to become pure energy, which I don't even know what that means for one, and feels like a very strange motivation. He doesn't even get his own boss battle as you fight Electro and Vulture together, and this fight wasn't quite as interesting as the other duo from the Sinister Six that you get to fight in a different villain battle. At number 8, I have Vulture. Vulture is in many ways pretty similar to Electro. They're both part of the Sinister Six, neither of them are developed all that much, and they're fought together. Vulture is a little higher because I felt like his motivation for helping Dr. Octopus was a bit more understandable. He had developed cancer due to his wings that Dr. Octopus was going to help treat if he helped him. This just felt like a much more relatable motivation, and that's what led him to just being a tiny bit higher than Electro on this list. At number 7, I've got Rhino. Who doesn't love a Russian criminal in a gigantic robotic rhino suit? It's a super interesting combination of terrifying and comical. Rhino is another one of the Sinister Six and isn't really given a lot more development than any of the others. You do have to avoid being spotted by him in a stealth section as Miles, which does give him a bit more screen time, but he's very much a brute force kind of villain. You ram into it with your head and ask questions later. The reason he's a little higher in the rankings is that his boss battle was a bit more interesting than the other duo battle for me. With his tough armor, Spider-Man has to stun him with heavy environmental items in order to get close and do some damage. Rhino and Scorpion also make for a more comical pair, as well as they tend to snipe at each other during the battle, which adds a little extra layer of fun to that boss fight. And at number 6, I have Scorpion. Speaking of the other part of that duo, we come to the last of the Sinister Six that didn't really have a larger part in the overall story. I'm placing Scorpion as the top of this group mainly due to the part of the game where he poisons Spider-Man and takes you on this wild trip that kind of reminded me of when Batman was hit by fear gas in the Arkham series of games. It's crazy and trippy and just really memorable. Swinging over a poison-flooded New York with giant scorpion tails coming out of that poison is not an image you're going to forget quickly. You also have to battle him or your hallucinations of him during this segment, giving him a little extra time in the game than some of the others. He also joins Rhino's fight, and as I said earlier, I found their banter to be pretty amusing as they do not work together very well at all. A weakness that Spider-Man takes advantage of fully when fighting them. Scorpion just seemed to play a slightly bigger role than any of the other members of the Sinister Six who were just broke out of the raft partway through the game, and that's why he's the top member of that group for me. At number 5, we have Tombstone. So we're cracking the top 5 with this villain who has his own side quest chain. Tombstone is a villain who has invulnerability due to exposure to chemicals. He was hired by Mr. Negative and the demons to provide them with an APC, but this is just kind of his introduction in the story. Like, that doesn't really go too far in and of itself. In his side quest chain, Tombstone is interested in trying to use the chemicals that made him invulnerable to create a drug that would give temporary invulnerability to others. His main plan is to use it for his own gang, for their criminal activities, and also to sell it on the black market to the criminal underground so that he could be set up rather nicely financially. I felt like this is one of the first villains on this list that had an overarching plan, besides maybe gaining more followers with Screwball. Sure, it is a fairly small scale story, but it still created a threat, and Tombstone was an interesting villain that took both the strength of Spider-Man, but also the scientific knowledge of Peter Parker to create a counter-drug to nullify Tombstone's invulnerability. While his side story wasn't huge and he didn't play a giant role in the larger story, I still found him to be one of the more interesting and well-done villains in the game. At number 4, I've got Kingpin. Wilson Fisk, also known as the Kingpin of Crime, is the first boss you face at the very start of the game. Even though he's taken out fairly quickly, there is a sense of him still being in the shadows even after you've defeated him. While I am a bit uncertain how much Fisk could have held back the demons from taking things over, his defeat is implied as the reason for the events of the game. The demons are filling in the power vacuum created by the Kingpin being taken down, which in turn kind of sets off a chain reaction of events with numerous groups trying to fill that vacuum over time. There is just so much interesting about Kingpin as a villain. He starts the game off in a pretty epic fashion, but again, the impressive nature of Kingpin is that he still feels active and even something of a threat while he's behind bars. His companies are still trying to make him money, his thugs are still committing crimes, and Fisk is clearly trying to still be active in crime despite being behind bars. It's impressive to take down a villain and end his threat, but it is another level of impressive to take down a villain and still have him feel like a threat behind the scenes. So that's why I'm sticking the Kingpin at number 4. At number 3, I've got Hammerhead. Now here we move from the main game to the DLC. Hammerhead is the head of one of the Maggia crime families and is the overarching villain in all 3 chapters of the DLC. After the events of the main game, Hammerhead is inspired by Sable International's earlier actions to take over the Maggia and then to take over all of New York, again trying to fill in that void of power left by the Kingpin. Hammerhead is a formidable foe who you have to face multiple times. He's cunning and constantly working on making himself himself powerful. He's an interesting combination between old school gangster and pushing for technological superiority. His motivation may be pretty simple, just, taking control over everything, but it is also one that allows for him to be ruthless to anyone who gets in the way of that motivation. This is particularly seen in how he deals with the police during his reign of terror. Throughout the DLC, he is constantly looking not just to make his group of thugs more powerful, but himself, personally more powerful by using Sable tech. By the end of the DLC, he has effectively turned himself into a full-on cyborg. It takes the combined efforts of Spider-Man and Silver Sable with a little behind-the-scenes help from Black Cat to finally take him down. His story doesn't maybe have quite the emotional impact as the top two villains, but he's a surprisingly tough villain to overcome and leaves his own emotional scars on some of our characters in the process. Number 2 is Mr. Negative. I didn't really know much about Mr. Negative before playing Marvel Spider-Man. My first introduction to him was through Marvel Snap, actually, but I didn't really know much about his story. While I don't know how much this version in the game is similar to the comic book counterpart, I do know that I was pretty impressed with the dynamic that Mr. Negative brings to the story. What's so interesting about this villain is that both his positive and negative sides seem genuine. As Martin Lee, he really seems like he's trying to do good and help people, but his quest for revenge against Norman Osborn allows the negative side of him to take over. This reality makes for a pretty significant impact when you realize that the kind of generous man you meet early in the game is really a villain and the head of a criminal organization trying to dismantle New York in the quest to destroy Norman Osborn. Not only is there significant emotional impact to Mr. Negative, but he also winds up being a formidable villain. He bombs City Hall, killing the father of Miles Morales, Jefferson Davis. He's able to corrupt regular people and get them to do his bidding. He's also no slouch to take on in combat either, as you'll find out when you face him a couple of times over the course of the game. It is this combination of emotional impact on the story, and level of danger that lands him at number 2 on my list. And then, last but not least, at number 1, we have Dr. Octopus. Despite the threat and emotional impact that Mr. Negative had, there is one villain in Marvel Spider-Man that tops him. That is Dr. Octopus himself, Otto Octavius. While it's not a total surprise, as any fan of Spider-Man knows that Otto becomes Dr. Octopus in most cases, the way you watch Otto's descent into becoming the villain, Dr. Octopus, though, is heartbreaking. As Peter Parker, you're working with Otto from the beginning of the game. You are working to create better prostheses for those who have lost limbs. Otto is a mentor to Peter and leads him to believe that he may be able to do just as much good as Peter Parker, if not more, than he is as Spider-Man. Otto, like Martin Lee, has a history with Norman Osborn, and as Norman uses his power as mayor to effectively shut down all of Peter and Otto's progress, this becomes a catalyst that changes Otto's trajectory to one of a villain. Of course, to add insult to injury here, Otto is also diagnosed with an illness that is making his body lose strength. So this makes him desperate to find a way to have limbs that are movable with his mind so that he can continue to work and that his mind doesn't go to waste in an empty shell of a body. Now, this set of circumstances leads Otto down a dark path, and he makes his grand appearance as Dr. Octopus in the third act of the game, causing a prison breakout at the Raft and setting up the Sinister Six to take out Norman Osborn and anyone who gets in their way. He is smart, cunning, and ruthless, even overpowering Spider-Man a couple times, one of those to the point of nearly killing him. All this wasn't bad enough. Otto had at some point figured out that Peter was Spider-Man. That knowledge did nothing to stay his hand. He was willing to kill Peter to fulfill his revenge, even justifying it to himself that Peter had somehow betrayed him. It's an emotional gut punch and just tops off a phenomenal and emotional journey as we see the depths that Otto Octavius has fallen to by the end of the game. So not only is Dr. Octopus the best villain of Marvel's Spider-Man, the way his story is handled here is perhaps one of the best villain stories I've played. I found it very impressive to take someone we already know will turn into a villain, or at least highly suspect will, and make that story have the emotional heft and surprise that it did. I just thought that it was super well done. So that's my ranking of the villains from Marvel Spider-Man. There are quite a few villains that you wind up facing in the main story and the DLC, but not all of them are given the same level of detail and involvement in the narrative. There weren't any that I disliked. Sure, Screwball is my lowest ranked, but to be honest, I still didn't mind her that much. She's more of a wacky villain, but is still used in a pretty fun way. How close did my rankings land to your own? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. Again, these are just my opinions, and I am well aware that others may have different ones. Talking about our different opinions is half the fun in lists like these. So again, feel free to let me know your thoughts. That's all for this list though, so we'll see you in the next video.